that's what we'll do. Shabbat Shalom. If we are here, that's a good sign. As Ernest Hemingway wrote in A Farewell to Arms, the best people possess a feeling for beauty, the courage to take risks, the discipline to tell the truth, the capacity for sacrifice. Ironically, their virtues make them vulnerable. They are often wounded, sometimes destroyed. Papa Hemingway knew of what he spoke. In this week's Parsha, the divine presence calls to Abram, "Go for yourself from your land, from your relatives, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation." And Abram went. And thus, the Jewish story begins with the family leaving everything of its past, following an unseen voice, heading into the unknown. From start to end, Lech Lecha is a tale of exposure, uncertainty, and unrelenting vulnerability. Famine, the abduction of Sarah into Pharaoh's house, the war of the kings, fights over land use, the parting of Abram and his nephew Lot, and the subsequent kidnapping of Lot all occur in the first half of the Parsha alone. In the second half, amid continued infertility, and where we began today, Sarai gives Abram her maidservant Hagar, an arrangement in which we imagine Hagar had no say. She promptly conceives, but flees into the desert after painful conflict with Sarai. And as this immense parsha concludes, Abram is commanded to circumcise his own foreskin at the age of 99, and to do the same with every male person in his household. The potential for tragedy at every turn of this parsha is staggering. The biblical characters are vulnerable in the most classic definition of the word. As the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it, they are, quote, capable of being physically or emotionally wounded, at risk, or endangered. How incredibly vulnerable so many of us feel at this moment in history. As Jews, lovers of Israel and America, and human beings on a volatile planet, safety and security feel terribly out of reach. Maybe such aspirations have never been all that realistic, as just a surface reading of our Torah portion starkly suggests. It is enough to make any sensible person retreat logically behind a facade of impenetrability, to try to build walls ever higher, ever wider, to keep the world and its dangers away from what we perceive as our increasingly fragile defenses. But that's where the Torah and the teachings of our sages, then and now, become again and always my greatest source of inspiration and wisdom. Every instance of naked vulnerability in this week's sacred story has within it the seeds of growth and redemption. Though the episodes are challenging and even quite disturbing, Sarai's stay in the Egyptian palace results in a fine reward for Abram and his retinue. The war and the capture of Lot establishes Abram as a courageous leader who models the essential value of pidyon shavuim, rescuing the captives. Hagar, in one of the most exposed stories in the entire Bible, receives one of the most powerful mystical visions of anyone in the Torah and beyond. And Abraham's circumcision makes possible the birth of Isaac, and for the first Jewish couple to be reborn as Abraham and Sarah, with their new names infused with the holy presence. Now, of course, it all began with their willingness to leave everything behind, to be vulnerable to the uncertainties of a world that far too often does not treat their descendants as a blessing, despite that beautiful promise. And even a world where, as we learn in Genesis 15, verse 13, a world where, as the divine presence says to Abram, your offspring shall be oppressed strangers in a land not their own. Friends, I wrote most of this just after the High Holy Days. So lest you wonder, it was written before this week's election. I wrote it in the sukkah that was still standing, purposefully, out into that fragile and vulnerable structure, sitting, thankfully, amid singing birds, with floating clouds and gorgeous smelling roses that still dare to open their beautiful faces to this upside down world. And sitting there, the value of vulnerability was feeling terribly relevant. However, far from being only a negative, vulnerability opens us up to beauty, to the awareness of our transience, and to the sense of mystery and amazement that should rightly inform all of our words, deeds, hours, and days. In researching this little piece, I came across a wonderful article called "The Role of Vulnerability in Jewish Life." I was delighted to learn it was written by an undergraduate student at Yeshiva University, Akiva Garner, and I commend it to you. It is linked on the J Weekly page, or I can send you the link. Such a well-written piece. This beautiful young man, Akiva Garner, who answered my email immediately when I wrote to him to tell him how much I loved his piece. He defines vulnerability as, quote, the character trait, the midah, in which a person admits either to themselves or others their own incompleteness or even weakness. Vulnerability is not tantamount to one oversharing all their difficulties to the world. Rather, it is more directly a person's willingness to present themselves to others as someone aware of and comfortable with the fact that their attempts to succeed are often inseparable from failures to get there. Young Mr. Garner suggests that in all aspects of Jewish life, in prayer, in our communal structures, and in our adaptation of Jewish practice, vulnerability and humility are absolutely crucial for both our stability and our growth. To admit our dependence on the source of life and to articulate all that we lack and hope to yet become, as Abram does when he implores God for a child, is to move toward answering the call that came to our first father, to go for, to, and within ourselves, to discover what extraordinary things may yet lay ahead, even if our dreams and our hopes feel quite thwarted, and though they may never be fully realized. The journey that begins with Abram and Sarai this week was and still is for us, their children, full of risk and so much uncertainty and danger. But the entire Jewish enterprise has been defined by a daring commitment to standing up to and apart from tyrants, despots, and empires that so often expose and threaten our very beings. And yet, despite this ongoing dreadful war, political instability, and the searing pain of the reality that our hostages are yet to be released, we must continue to advocate for justice and peace with every breath, to act with chesed, and generosity, to circumcise the foreskins of our hardened hearts, as we are told in Deuteronomy 10:16, and remain vulnerable and open, not just to the whims and swirling winds of fate, but always, always, always to the possibilities and promise of life and its uncountable blessings. May we be worthy of them. Shabbat Shalom.